Hey y'all, it's Ashley Bookishrealm and I'm back with another video. As you can see by the title of this video, I am here to talk about 30 books by the time you turn 30, or 30 books you should read before you turn 30. I haven't really decided on the title yet, but it's going to be somewhere along those lines. So this was the Patreon video pick of the month of February. Pattern here, I never really get these up in the month in which they're supposed to go. It's just, I've had a lot going on. It's been a lot. There's been a lot going on. So before we get started, I want to talk a little bit about Book of the Month. So thank you so much to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. Book of the Month is a super popular and fast-growing online book service for readers. Their mission is to promote new and emerging authors and help readers discover books that they'll end up loving. So the way that it works is that each month the Book of the Month team spends time vetting through hundreds of books to come up with a specially curated list of early release and newly released titles. So when I say early release titles, I definitely mean that we do sometimes get the opportunity to read books before they're actually released. And this is super beneficial because it allows people to spend more time reading and less time researching, which if you're like me and you don't have much time, like you are on a tight schedule, it is nice to have that special curated list of books to choose from. One of my favorite things about Book of the Month is that they provide us with a wide range of books to check out, whether that is, you know, books that are like historical fiction, whether you like romance, whether you like literary fiction, whether you like non-fiction. There is something there for everyone, which I always appreciate. Book of the Month is risk-free. They do have a skip policy, so if there's ever a month that you do not want to select a book, you can skip that month and you will not be charged for it. In addition to that, they have the best prices for newly released hardcovers. If you're like me too, you're balling on a budget, newly released hardcovers are extremely expensive, and I know that I can't always afford them, so it's always great to have that option of getting them at a reduced price. So if you use my code today, which is Bookishrealm, and the link in the description box below, you'll be able to get your first book from Book of the Month for just $9.99. Remember that code is Bookishrealm, and I will leave both of those, the link and the code, down in the description box below. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump into this month's selections. Every month your books will come in this blue Book of the Month box. They also include a bookmark. This one says new books, same laundry, I'm not folding, which I feel like I'm getting called out by this one because I have laundry that I have not folded or put away yet, and yes, I feel personally attacked by this one. So typically Book of the Month does provide us with 5 options during each month's selection. However, for the month of March, we have 7 titles that you get to select from. So let's go through and see what those 7 titles are. The first one that I have here is Tell Me Everything, and this is about a private investigator by the name of Erica. And Erica does not usually take on cases that are about sexual assault, but she has a case that is given to her and she decides that she is going to do the investigation of the case. She usually steers away from it because of the fact that she has too many like personal feelings about it. She then spends 5 years kind of like honing in on her skills and investigating sexual assaults, and particularly one that is ingrained in a university, looking at their football program. So of course the case eventually grows and then it ends up being a national scandal, and at the same time the case and Erica's life implode, and she has to figure out how to win the case without losing herself. This one sounds extremely interesting. I think the cover is pretty unique, but I think this is one definitely that I would have to take my time with because of the sensitive nature of the topic. The next book is The Unsinkable Greta James. This is about a young woman who's in the music industry. She loses her mother and she ends up just falling apart on stage. The video ends up going viral and it is detrimental to her career, and her father pretty much tells her, like, this is why I wanted you to choose a more practical career and not something where you were doing music in this way. So they decided to go on this cruise, which was supposed to be a trip that her mother and father went on for their anniversary, but they decided to go together to kind of reconcile their relationship, especially since they're sharing in the loss of, you know, her mother. And she ends up meeting another person who's on the ship who is a teacher, I believe, and they they end up building a relationship and relying on each other for a number of different things. I think this one probably is going to explore grief in a very interesting way, so I'm looking forward to looking at this one as well. The next one that I have here is the Verifiers. This one sounds really interesting, and I'm digging the cover. It is about a main character who has no wish or dream to live up to her familial expectations. Number one, marrying a Chinese boy. She prefers girls, which her family doesn't know, and she is looking at having a job in which she works for a mystery or detective online dating kind of company, which that combo is really interesting. But she loves Jane Austen, she likes mystery books, and she thinks it's going to be a great opportunity until a client goes missing. So I think that this is going to be an interesting like mystery, but then also explore those familial dynamics as well. The next one that I have here is the Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. This follows a true crime blogger who ends up meeting a woman by the name of Beth, and Beth is supposedly someone who is part of the two lady killers who kill men, and she was seen fleeing the scene, but then she was later acquitted for it. But then the blogger Shea ends up getting the opportunity to interview Beth. She asks her if she wants to be interviewed, and Beth says yes. So she meets her at her mansion, and she goes there to talk about different things, and she realizes that something is off about the entire situation, where there are things that are moving with like no one actually moving the objects, so they're moving by themselves. And then there is a point in which she thinks she sees a girl. So this seems like it may have some paranormal elements, but I also wonder if it's one of those thrillers where we think it's going to be paranormal, but really it's not because of the twist in it. But I'm excited to pick this up. I haven't read Simone St. James's other book, but I'm excited to dive into this one. The next one that I have here is The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. This one is about a young woman who goes to Paris to crash with her brother in his apartment. She gets to the apartment, she's like, this apartment looks like more than what my brother can afford, but oddly her brother never shows up. So she's trying to figure out, well, where's my brother? And she notices that her brother's, like, his neighbors are not really friendly. So in this you have like everybody suspect, her brother's missing, who did it? I have never read a Lucy Foley book before, but this one sounds really intriguing, and I've seen quite a few people reading it, so I'm excited to get to this one. The next one that I have here is Dating Dr. Dill, which seems to be a contemporary romance, and it is about a young woman who prefers to basically be like, you know, working on her car as opposed to being on dating websites. Her dad makes her a deal and says, like, if you get engaged in 4 months, I'll give you the house. So everything's going good until she goes on Dr. Dill, and she gets into an argument with said doctor on here, and the argument goes viral. And it's interesting because he was there looking for funding, and then his funding basically kind of is shortchanged because of the fact that they got into this argument that goes viral. So then his aunties are like, well, convince her that you're her soulmate, and then when you know you are like matched up, then basically the money will come in terms of like donors. So this, I feel like this is going to be kind of interesting because you're trying to essentially convince someone to date you, like fake date you, but I don't know if he's going to tell her that they're fake dating. It's probably going to be really intriguing in that way. So this one sounds like it's going to be funny. And the last one for this month is The Cartographers. This is about a young woman who loves cartography. Her dad also was a cartographer, and they had a really great relationship until he fires her and humiliates her because of a map that she didn't think was important. But then her father ends up dead, and she realizes that this map is actually truly important, and that whoever knows of the existence, because this may be the last one, but whoever knows of the existence of these maps is pretty much trying to get rid of all of them, and so she's trying to figure out why they're getting rid of them. This is an interesting cover. I don't think I've ever read a book about cartography, so this might be an interesting read. All right, y'all, so those were the 7 selections for the month of March. Like I said before, if you're interested in joining Book of the Month, the code for the month is Bookishrealm, and you can use the link down in the description box below to get your first book for $9.99. Thank you so much to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. So before we jump into this list, I just have to preface this by saying that these are 30 books that I have enjoyed in the 30 years years of my life. And I think that these are 30 books that people should at least try before they turn 30. Even if you're already past 30, like, give these books a try. I just thought, you know, this would be a fun video, and patrons voted on it and they thought it would be a fun video too. So yeah, 30 by 30. So 30 books that you should read before you turn 30. And it's a wide variety, as always: picture books, middle grade, children's, YA, adult, across many different genres. So yes, let's jump into the list. And if there's books that you think that people should read before they turn 30, definitely add them to this list. Add them in the comments. Okay, so the first thing that I had to include on this list, which should be of no surprise to anybody, is that if you're gonna read any comic, and this is hard to do because there are a lot of comics that I think people should read, and I have a graphic novel on this list as well, but comic wise, I think that this definitely is one of my favorite comics of all time. And I talk about this a lot. I still haven't read my compendiums. This is compendium number 2 of Fables. It is about these fairy tale beings that have gotten basically kicked out of their own land, and they're being transported now to New York, where they're living, and they live undercover. This is really a great series for people who like fairy tales, and fairy tales that are kind of like fractured or flipped on their head. And it's just one of my favorite series. I think just the writing is really good. The artwork is great. I think that the storytelling is great. I will warn everyone, and I talk about this series quite a bit on my channel, this series is extremely expansive. It's huge. There's a lot of spin-offs. So if you're diving into Fables, just understand that it is a huge commitment, but it's definitely worth checking out. And it is one of my favorites of all time. Hopefully, you know, it makes me want to like pull out my first compendium and start reading it tonight, but I highly doubt I'll have time to do that. But, you know, here's to hopeful and wishful thinking. So the next one that I have is a children's book that a lot of people are probably familiar with, or they may not be familiar with. And the book that I chose was Frindle by Andrew Clements. The artwork is done by Brian Selznick, who a lot of people are familiar with Brian Selznick at this point. But Frindle is one of those books that has like stuck with me from my childhood to now. I've read a lot of Andrew Clements books, and Frindle is just a one that I thought was just hilarious, because it's about this young boy who basically goes to school and he decides that he's going to be a class clown, and he's going to ask his teacher like where every word has come from, or I can't remember if it's like the origins of every word or what, or how every word came to be. It's something weird about every word in the dictionary. So she decides that because he wants to be a class clown, she's going to make him write an essay about it. And then when he's in the process of writing this essay, he figures out like, well, people just kind of decide what words go in the dictionary. People kind of make those executive decisions. So he finds this pen in the middle of the street, and he decides to call it Frindle, which is and it's just a hilarious story. It's a story that I just have stuck to in my childhood, and it's one that has like really, I remember it. Like I just remember, I mean, I don't remember the details. It's been so long since I've read Frindle. Actually, should probably reread Frindle. It's been so long since I've read it, but it's one of those like children's classics that I absolutely adored growing up. Like I said, I read quite a bit of Andrew Clements books. My mom still has some of my Andrew Clements books at her house. So definitely, like, if you've never read any Andrew Clements, I definitely would recommend starting with Frindle. But this is one that I think personally for me just meant a lot to put it on this list. The next one that I have on this list is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. And I think that every human should read at least one Toni Morrison book before they die. I have this on like books to read before you turn 30, but I think that if you have not had the opportunity yet and you're past 30, you definitely should pick up a Toni Morrison book. I think that you have to be, I don't want to say you have to be at a certain age, but I think that I couldn't have appreciated this book until I reached a certain age, and I was in my 20s the first time I picked up Toni Morrison. And this book is, you know, very trauma heavy. It's a very difficult book to pick up. It is often frequently challenged because of the content. It's about a little girl who wishes that she had blue eyes, and you kind of follow her narrative as well as a narrative of a couple other characters. And what's so sad about it is that it's very centered much so like in this summer. I believe it takes place in the 40s. Y'all correct me if I'm wrong. And so many things happen to this poor little girl in this story, and it's very difficult to read, but I think that there's a lot to be said of what comes out of The Bluest Eye, and it is a text that I'm still to this day kind of unsure of whether I will ever reread The Bluest Eye, because Toni Morrison just can write a hitter, like can definitely write a hitter. But it is a book that I think has propelled me into wanting to read more Toni Morrison, but I have also used it as a means to understand that Toni Morrison's works are not to be taken lightly, and you don't just read them, like just fly through them and breeze through them. Like, these are books that you take your time with, because it's a lot within the content, and Toni Morrison, of course, always has so much to say and conveys her messages in such deep and sometimes dark ways, but nevertheless they're messages that we all need to have access to. So it's, like I said, it's been a while since I've read this one, but I must say, like, even if you don't pick up The Bluest Eye, you gotta pick up at least like one Toni Morrison book. So the next book that I included on this list is one that I don't think I've really ever talked about on this channel, because it is a book that I read prior to me really having a booktube channel, and it is The Life of Pi by Jan Martel. This is one that I picked up because myself and my sorority sisters decided that we wanted to have a book club, and for some reason we thought like The Life of Pi would be the book to read. I was the only person that finished the book. It is definitely one of the more dense books that I've read in my lifetime, but when the story itself comes full circle, I really appreciated what the author was doing in terms of like the relativity of truth and our whole idea of belief, our belief systems. It's a very intriguing text in general. So if you've never heard of The Life of Pi, it is about this young boy by the name of Pi who ends up on a shipwreck, and he is on this shipwreck with animals, and he's surviving. I believe it was over 200 days. I can't remember the exact number, but I know it was over 200 days he spends on this ship, and it's about basically his survival. But there's so many more pieces of the puzzle that go together, and you can't really explain how the pieces are kind of interconnected. I think it's another huge theme of the book is interconnectedness, and you don't really understand that until you get to the end and everything just kind of makes sense. So it's just one of those books where it was difficult in some ways in terms of like how dense the writing was, but I think the overall concept and theme behind the story is something that I really did end up appreciating and enjoying. Of course, I couldn't make this list without including The Complete Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi. This is one that Bree and I recently read for our comic book club, and I have read this book so many different times. It is such a powerful story about I don't even say our main character, because it is a nonfiction graphic novel memoir about Marjane's life growing up during the Iranian Revolution and coming of age, and just a lot of different things that she had to deal with. And it really breaks down what was going on in Iran during the Iranian Revolution and the role that imperialism played in all of that, and how it just went through so many different changes. And I mean, even to the point where, like, you know, you have cultural changes that happen when people were taking over the country. You went from one extreme to another extreme, and it is just such a powerful book. One of my favorite graphic novels of all time. I cannot say enough about Persepolis. It will always be a favorite. I will always reread this graphic novel, and I was introduced to this book my freshman year of college. We had what we call kind of like a freshman read, like everyone was reading the same book and they were discussing it in their English classes or like their university like 101 classes, and I had already gotten my English credit, so I was using it as a discussion piece in my University 101 classes, but I would have never known anything about this book had it not been for that read where like we all had to end up reading the same book and discussing it. And I read it so much, and I watched the film adaptation so much. It really is just such a great piece of work. I am so glad that I actually got the opportunity to annotate it this time, but I can't wait to reread it again. It is one of those books too that's not to be taken lightly. It is heavy with a lot of dark themes, but I mean, I commend Marjane for even writing this story. Okay, so the next one that I have on this list is Speak by Lori Halse Anderson. I actually have quite a few books on this list that have been banned or challenged, which is interesting. So Speak by Lori Halse Anderson it's an older YA book. It was published in 99, I believe, and it focuses on a young girl who is ostracized after being sexually assaulted at a party, and she refuses, well, she calls the police while she's at the party, and she refuses to tell like why she called the police. So she's ostracized because she called the police, but people don't realize the reason why she called the police is because she was actually sexually assaulted. And it is a book that I needed in a very important time in my life, and I think that this is one of those books that's short but definitely packs a heck of a punch. It's always interesting. I tell people that this book actually has a movie adaptation that features Kristen Stewart, however you say her name. Well, we all know from Twilight. I know that, you know, there's movies past that, but that there is a movie adaptation with Kristen Stewart in it, which is really interesting. I was not expecting it to be so intense. It was less than 200 pages, but it definitely was. It is one that I reread a lot. I haven't reread it, I think, in a couple years, but it's one that I need to reread soon. This is going to surprise people for me to include this on this list, but I did include Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy on this list. I think that, and my copy is somewhere in the other room. I don't even have my copy on me right now, but Anna Karenina is one of those stories that I think is unexpectedly like enjoyable. When I first read Anna Karenina, it took me about 4 months to get through it, but I was very surprised about how much I enjoyed the writing and how I enjoyed the story itself. Definitely a story about betrayal and selfishness and what we think is love and passion, and I was very surprised about how it ended. I had no idea that that's how Anna Karenina ended. I was shocked by the ending, and I was shocked by how much I enjoyed Tolstoy's writing style. He is definitely one of those authors that is extremely descriptive. There was a whole passage in the book where literally we are listening to, or not listening to, I think listening to, where we are like reading about someone cutting grass. And it is the most beautiful writing that I have ever read, which is so shocking. I'm like, I'm really enjoying the fact that this man is cutting grass. Like the details with which it was written, just for me, I was surprised because it's kind of hard for me to see things. I've talked about this before in a video where I said I have aphantasia, where it is hard for me to actually visualize things as I'm reading it. So the fact that this man was extremely descriptive, it helped me a lot in reading it. But it's definitely character driven. I mean, there's plot, but it's a character driven book, and I think I was just proud of myself for having devoured that classic in 4 months, which I never expected, you know, to be capable of doing such a thing, and I was. Now, I don't know if this is something that everyone would be interested in reading, but I think that I would at least give it a try. Maybe not before you turn 30, like just give it a try in your lifetime. If you don't like it, you don't like it, but definitely one that I think, you know, before 30, which I have read it before I turned 30. I think I read it in my mid-20s. The next one that I have on my list is the Nana series by Ayazawa. This is one of the most pivotal manga series for me personally that I have ever read. It's shoujo. It is, well, I think it's more is it josei or josai? Someone correct me on the pronunciation on that, because it is really young adult women. And I don't say young adult like when we think young adult as in like teen fiction. I think like young adult like graduated from high school, early 20s. And it's about two women by the name of Nana who both move to Tokyo to kind of fulfill their aspirations. They're trying to navigate life, and this kind of starts off as a series that's just, I don't want to say whimsical, because whimsical is not the right word. It's one of those series that starts off where it kind of like, oh, okay, yeah, these two like are becoming friends, yada yada yada, but then it becomes a lot more intense as you go through the series. And Nana is a very like comfort place for me when I talk about manga. It is a series that I've been trying to finish for years. Have I finished it? Absolutely not. Isn't my intention to finish it this year? No. Like, my intention is to get through, like, you know, 5 volumes of Nana this year and kind of, you know, catch up on the story. It is unfinished, but if I was going to include any manga series, Nana was going to be on this list. It was hard to choose between Food Wars and Nana because I think they both emotionally came to me in a time where I needed them, but Nana just has my heart, like, under its hold, so I definitely needed to include it. The next one that I have is Light for the World to See by Kwame Alexander. This is a book that I read in 2020, and it was my favorite book of 2020, and amazingly, it's extremely short. It is, I believe, 1,000 words, and it was powerful. Kwame Alexander is a poet. A lot of his books have, like, are written in verse, or they have like verse elements to them, and this was the first time that I don't know if this is his first adult book, because he usually writes for middle grade, young adult audience, and children, but I can't remember if this is his only adult book, but this is the first adult book. If he has more, this is the first adult book that I've read from him, and it blew my mind away. It made me cry. It talked about a lot of things that I feel as a Black person living in America. A lot of it had to do with race, and it was hopeful. And a lot of times it's easy, and this is one of those conversations that's going on right now. Talking about race can be very exhausting and draining, like race and racism. It can be very exhausting and draining. It's something that I do as part of my work, and I am tired. Like I'm physically tired after doing things like that, because it drains you. And he wrote about race and racism, but with hope. And because, you know, 2020 was just a really dark year. It was a dark year for all of us. And for him to come out with a book that just had so much hope in it, it just made me feel like things will get better. I don't know if I will ever see it in my time. I'm hoping that, you know, maybe my daughter will see it, and the hope that one day the world will get itself together. So I had to include that because I just have never read a book that was just, especially because it's nonfiction, that is just so daggone hopeful and literally just touched me to my core. So I love Kwame. I actually had the opportunity to interview Kwame before, and he's such a great human. If you've never read anything by Kwame Alexander, you don't have to start with this one, but just check out one Kwame Alexander book. The next one that I included on this list is Salt to the Sea by Ruta Sepetys. I recently read her newest release, which is I Must Betray You. And Ruta Sepetys is a young adult historical fiction writer. And the reason why I wanted to include her on this list is because I think that a lot of times historical fiction, especially YA historical fiction, really centers itself on World War I, World War II, from the perspective of the Allied powers. And it can get kind of redundant seeing those stories over and over again. And Ruta Sepetys changes the game. So not all of her books take place during World War I or World War II, because like I Must Betray You dealt with the Romanian Revolution. I don't know why I couldn't get that out. Dealt with the Romanian Revolution in 1989. And this one, though, specifically Salt to the Sea, is one that I wanted to include. This is one that I've read twice now. The first time I read it, I was like, oh my goodness, this is so powerful. Like, it's a great story. I love that we're looking at World War II from the perspective of Lithuanians, and that it looks at one of the greatest maritime disasters in history outside of the Titanic, and it's often forgotten about. I just could not listen. When I read this the second time, I cried like a baby. I actually did a full standalone review on my channel for this one. I'll link it in the card symbol above. I cried, y'all. I cried and I cried and I cried and I cried, especially like towards the end of this. I could not. The writing was beautiful. It is such a beautiful book. And I have a tab here that's green tabs, sad moments. So quite a few of those green tabs. But if you have never read Ruta Sepetys, I highly recommend it. Salt to the Sea is also connects it to her book Between the Shades of Grey, which it took me a while to figure that out. So I definitely have a copy of that one, I believe, and I'm going to read that one. I just need to make it through her backlist. But Ruta Sepetys had to make it on this list. The next book that I had to add on this list is one that never really got as much shine, I think, in this community as it did in the larger book community. This was a National Book Award finalist, and that is American Straight by E.B. Savoy. I haven't read this book in a while, but this was my first introduction to E.B. Savoy as a writer. Since then, I've read a couple of her other works, but this one still stands to be one of my favorites because it is about a young girl by the name of Fabiola, and she's leaving Haiti with her mom to immigrate to the United States. I believe they're going to Michigan, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Detroit. They're going to Detroit, Michigan, and her mother gets stopped basically as they're going through customs, and she gets sent back, but Fabiola makes it through. And it is really a great insight to the difference between being Black in America and being Black in other places around the globe. And I don't know if, like, sometimes we realize how big those differences can be, and it is definitely a testimony to, you know, Black people not being a monolith, and that we all bring different things to the table. Because when Fabiola is in Detroit, I mean, she is Black, but she has a difficult time navigating being around Black people in Detroit because it's just a completely different experience. It's not something that she is used to. And it was interesting to see, like, the clashing of two cultures on page. And this one has a little bit of representation of voodoo culture in it. There's a little bit of, like, I don't want to say mystical, but, like, it's some magical elements in here that I don't want to say too much about it, but it is on page and is very interesting. But I want more people to read American Straight because it is one of my favorites by her. And I had some issues with it. It's not a perfect book. It wasn't even a 5-star read for me when I read it, but it's a story that stuck with me. And I always think about stories that stick with me as, like, it may not have been 5-star, all-time favorite, but it's one that I've carried with me, and this is definitely one of those stories. So the next one that I have is really interesting. I don't have a copy of it, and I don't even know if I could still get a copy of this. It may be out of print. It's The Talking Eggs, a folk tale from the American South. It's by Robert D. Sansucci. I have another one of his books up here somewhere, one of his other picture books that I read for my mermaid vlog. And this one is illustrated by Jerry Pickney, who is one of the greatest children's book illustrators of all time. Unfortunately, I believe he passed away this year, or it was the end of last year, but he just recently passed away, I would say within like the past 6 months. Such a great loss to the children's book world, but it is based on a Creole folklore about a young girl who is mistreated by her family. She meets a woman in the woods and she gives her these eggs that contain treasures. It's a great picture book. It is one that I think you can read to younger audiences. It's one that adults will enjoy. Like, it just is one of those ones, again, that has stuck with me because I remember reading this when I was younger. I think this book may have come out in like the 80s. So it's definitely one that I had growing up, and one that I love so much, and I really, really need to read. It's been years since I've reread it, but it's one of my favorite picture books of all time. The next one I have on this list is Heroine by Minnie McGinnis. This was my first Minnie McGinnis book, and I haven't read one by her since this one, but Heroine has stuck with me. A lot of these books are books that have stuck with me for, like, the time in which I've been reading, the 30 years of my life. This is an intense book. I don't really take heroin lightly when it comes to Minnie McGinnis, like, or I just don't take heroin the book, not heroin when it comes to Minnie McGinnis. Not that, I said that completely wrong. I don't take this book lightly at all. It is a snapshot of the opioid epidemic. It's about a young girl who gets into a car accident with a close friend of her. I think it was her teammate. And they both play softball, very competitive. Their team is really good. The town loves the team. And she gets opioids as a way to cope with the pain, or to deal with the pain. She's prescribed opioids, and an addiction starts. And you literally see this girl hit rock bottom. okay? I mean, there's no censorship, there's no filtering, there's no nothing. Like, you see her go from pills to straight heroin and to black tar heroin, which in itself is I remember reading this book right after I had baby girl. She couldn't have been more than 6 months when I read this book, because I remember sitting on the recliner right over there and holding her when I think she was just sleeping. And I remember just devouring the book, just reading it and just being so mind blown, because it makes you think about the fact that you have two characters. I mean, we follow one character, but her friend also was in an accident. She also was prescribed opiates, but when she, was finished taking her doses, she was done. She was good. But our main character could not get off of it. Like, it makes you think about what makes one person have an addiction and another not. Why do some people get addicted to things and others do not? Like, that whole question is really, it's just so mind-boggling, and it's definitely something that you can see kind of unfold in this book. I'm not going to talk about it too much. I haven't reread it yet, but I do plan to reread it, and I had to include it on here. The next book that I'm going to include on here is not one that I even really have to talk about, because so many of you have heard of The Deep. You know what The Deep is about. It is by River Solomon with David Diggs, William Hudson, and Jonathan Snipes. And this is a book that's definitely hard to read, a lot of trauma, and it is short, y'all. I couldn't believe, I read this from my mermaid vlog, which if you want to know more of my thoughts on it, I will link my mermaid vlog up in the description above. It took me forever to read this, and this is 100 and let's see here how long this book is. This book is 163 pages. 163 pages, and it took me forever to read it. And this is one that I went in on the annotations. I did a lot. I was even writing my thoughts at the end of chapters. It was a lot, and I actually have a live show discussion that we did on my channel a while ago, which I'll also share with y'all, but I had to put this on the list. It's not everybody's cup of tea. You may or may not enjoy it, but I think it's one definitely worth giving a try. The next one on this list is one that I wouldn't have read without Bethany from Beautifully Bookish Bethany, and it's In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado, and it is definitely a tough read. Also, a lot of these, I mean, some of these are not tough reads, but some, but some of them are. And The Dream House is a memoir of sorts about interpersonal violence that takes place in our relationship that Carmen Maria Machado had, and it is specifically looking at that in queer relationships and how that's not often studied. A lot of, interpersonal violence or domestic violence is through hetero cis relationships, and so it was interesting seeing it from this lens. Definitely interesting in terms of the storytelling method, but not an easy book to digest either, but one that it has stuck with me, and it came to me at the right time, if that even makes any type of sense whatsoever. Of course, I had to include Ace by Angela Chen, What Asexuality Reveals About Desire, Society, and the Meaning of Sex. This is another book that has stuck with me because Ace taught me a lot about myself and a lot about what it means to identify as ace, and that asexuality exists on a spectrum. I think that what was most interesting about this is how society has certain implications for asexuality and what barriers it puts up for individuals who identify as asexual. And Angela Chen dives into so many different aspects of it that I just learned so much, and about myself and just about a lot of things. I push this book on everybody. So if they're going to pick up a nonfiction book, I mean, Ace is definitely one of those books where it's a must read, y'all. It is a must read. I had to include a Sharon Draper book, and this is the one that I wanted to go with. This is Copper Sun, and this is won the Coretta Scott King Award. This is I would say more YA. than middle grade. I definitely would say we classify this as teen fiction at my library. And this is a slave narrative about a young girl by the name of Amari. We see her get taken away from her home. She ends up in, the States, and she befriends an indentured servant by the name of Polly, and they're trying to make it to this Spanish colony in Florida that is a place of sanctuary, and it actually is based on this real life sanctuary that did exist. Sharon Draper did a lot of research into this. This is one that I read with a book club, and the book club was all white women, all probably 50 and older, and I was the book club leader, and we read this book. So there is a lot of history and feelings attached to this book, and it was a very interesting moment to share this book with these women, and the discussions that we had about it were much more interesting than what I expected. And there were a lot of barriers that were broken in terms of talking about things that made us uncomfortable, and this was years ago. So this book has stuck with me. I mean, Sharon Draper is an OG. Absolutely love her. I had the privilege of meeting her a few years back, and it was phenomenal. I loved it. A wonderful human. There's so much to check out from Sharon Draper, but this is one of my favorites of hers. The next thing that I have on my list is Kira Kira by Cynthia Karahoda. This is a Newbery winner, which means that it's going to be sad. Newbery winners are always sad. So this is about two sisters who move with their parents to Georgia. They are a part of a Japanese community in Iowa, but they end up moving to the South, and it is about some of their experiences being in Georgia and being Japanese and having to deal with some issues, some blatant racism, but it also is about sisterhood and familial relationships and how difficult those can be, and the bonds that people have with their siblings. It is so freaking sad. It is one of the saddest middle grade books I've ever read. It is so sad, but I try to recommend Kira Kira as much as possible because I don't know how many people actually know that this book exists, unless you're in library world. Then of course you know it as a Newbery winner. But y'all, if you ever get a chance to read this book, read it because it says Kira Kira, and I want to say read it. It's time for me to get some rest. The next book that I have on this list is Parachutes by Kelly Yang. Kelly Yang is one of my favorite authors. I am currently reading the 5th book of Kelly Yang's. Anything that Kelly Yang writes, I'm gonna read. She has literally just released her 5th book this month, and I'm currently reading it. I refuse to fall behind on anything that she puts out. This is her YA debut, and it's about two young girls who are at school, and it's about the concept of parachutes, kids who get sent from Asia to the United States to go to these schools to further their education. And this is not for the faint of heart either. I think that this cover is often a misconception. I don't know what people think that this book is about until they read it and they realize that it is just a tad bit darker than what you think. It deals heavily with sexual assault and rape, and the two main characters dislike each other so much in the beginning, but they build such a tight bond and a friendship, and it's also about watching them grow that bond between each other. And I was not expecting it to be as intense as it was because of the cover, but you find out why the story is told in the back when Kelly Yang kind of gives an author note. And I always tell people, when you read this book, make sure you also read the author's note, because it's very pivotal to understanding, or it's very necessary, I should say, to understanding the whole context of the story. The next one that I wanted to include is one of my favorites by Christopher Paul Curtis. It is The Watsons Go to Birmingham. I had to read this book for a class that I was taking, and once again, one of my favorite children's books of all time. It is hilarious. It literally is about this family called the Watsons, and I believe that they are going from Detroit, or at least the Michigan area, down to south to Birmingham to visit their mother's family. And it is hilarious. It's 3 kids, 2 parents. They're making this trip, and the family dynamics are just funny. I always tell people, if you're going to read The Watsons Go to Birmingham, listen to it on audio, because the narration is hilarious. It is hilarious. It does, of course, cover some themes related to the civil rights movement, and so we see a lot of things that were happening in the 50s and 60s to the Black community. So there is, of course, some discussion of racism, especially because they're going from the north to the south, and even the way in which they have to take the journey is very unique to that specific period of time. So, but I mean, Christopher Paul Curtis is another one of those OG writers that I don't know how many people are really like actively aware of him. If you didn't read him when you were growing up, or like you never had to like study him in class, he's just amazing. I absolutely love him. Definitely read him. If you don't read The Watsons Go to Birmingham, he has plenty of other books to check out, but that is definitely my favorite. The next series that I'm going to include on here, I don't own any of these books anymore, and it's super unfortunate that I don't. It's the Wishbone series. I know that people are like, what, Ashley? These Wishbone books were a huge part of my childhood growing up. A huge part. It was my way of being introduced to classics at a young age, especially those like, like the retellings of like Romeo and Juliet, Journey to the Center of the Earth, all that stuff. And then there were like the Wishbone like mystery books, which I thought were really cool. And I used to love the show Wishbone when I was growing up, and the fact that they had like a series of books that kind of lined up with them, they were so great. I know that Olive from a book Olive actually has a series on her channel where she is reading, I believe she reads the Wishbone book and the book that the classic that may match it. I can't remember how she does it. It's been a while since I've watched one of them, but she does videos on these series of books. I definitely would recommend checking them out. I love Wishbone. I may be kind of like dumb of me to include it on this list, but I just had to, because if you haven't read a Wishbone book, I actually don't know where you would get any of them right now. Probably eBay would be your best bet, but so monumental. The next one that I have on this list is Brain on Fire, which I read, I believe, in 2017. This is when I was really starting to get into nonfiction, and this is another one that I was reading for a book club, and I was like, I'm not gonna like this one. I know that there's an adaptation of it. I still have not watched it. I heard that it's pretty good. It is literally following this young woman who is, she's fine one moment, and then things just start going left. I mean, haywire, like completely change in like personality and how she's functioning. She's not functioning well, and she's sick, and they can't figure out what is wrong with her. And it is a very interesting look at how, we have trained people in the medical field, and even they sometimes miss signs and clues and hints of what can be wrong with people, especially with those illnesses or diseases that are a little bit more on the rare side. But literally, like, they thought that she had a mental illness. That's what they were thinking, and she didn't. There was literally something like physically, not saying that mental illnesses cannot present themselves as being like physically, but there was something anatomically going on that was not indicative of a mental illness. Like, she had other stuff going on and they couldn't figure it out. And I think watching her story kind of play out is what pulled me so much into the story, and why I was so fascinated by how much people didn't. Like, these are people who go to school year, and I think they're still human. They don't know everything, and I think sometimes we put that faith in physicians and doctors or whatever to know everything, and they don't. Sometimes it takes them a while to figure out what exactly is going on with someone. Like I said, especially if it's one of those illnesses that is more on the rare side. The next one that I have on this list is Behold the Dreamers, which I don't know where my copy is. Like, it's somewhere in here. I just don't know where my copy is. Behold the Dreamers is one that I ended up reading a few years ago on a whim. I was just interested in, I think I had heard a little bit about it. I couldn't remember if someone else was reading it for like maybe a group read, and then I decided to read it, but I joined late. But I like this one because it really does flip the whole idea of the American dream on its head. I think that when I look at other countries and their perception of the American dream, it's never what it really is when they get here. And that is probably one of the most difficult things to accept, is realizing that the perception of what America is like and the reality of what America is like are two completely different things. And we follow this couple who they come to America hoping to get a piece of that like big American dream, only to realize that this is not what it seems. The husband ends up working for this guy who runs this huge financial, or he's part of this huge financial company, and he is his driver, and he learns a lot about the family, and wants to achieve the same level of monetary wealth that this guy has gotten into, that American dream, only to realize that it's not as attainable as America likes to make it seem. It very much so is a system that's not designed for everyone to reach that, that level of wealth, that level of comfort, that piece of that American dream. It's not reality. And I think that it was just well written. It was beautiful. I know that there are quite a few books that do that, but this one just did it so freaking well. And I really did appreciate how the two families, like their storylines, become intertwined with each other. The next one that I have on my list, I cheated here because I added two, and I shouldn't have added two. I had Pachinko and also Homegoing. And I included both of these books because I think in the time that I've been reading, I have realized that I really, really enjoy family sagas. So books where we get to see generation after generation of families, and both of these books do that in very interesting ways, and they're talking about completely different things. And I was so excited to read, because I read Homegoing first, so I was extremely excited to finally get the chance to pick up Pachinko, because I was like, oh, it's one of those intergenerational, like family saga type of books where every 50, 70 pages or so we're like getting a different narrative from a different generation of that family. And so if you're looking for books that are about like family saga type things, and you're getting to see a family's progression through various generations, I couldn't just pick one of these, y'all. I was so stuck on this. I was like, I need to pick one. I couldn't pick one. I had to keep two. I'm so sorry. All right, y'all. The next one that I have on this list is Monster. Which I forgot that I had this on here as one of my picks. So it's not the only manga that I have. I forgot that I had Monster on this list. Monster is also one of those manga series that came to me at a very great time, and it is a psychological thriller. So if you're into psychological thrillers, Monster is a series for you. It is about this guy who saves these twins, and one of the twins ends up becoming a serial killer. So then it's like, oh my gosh, like, did he make a mistake by saving the twin? Probably. But it just explores that, and it's completely fascinating manga. I have only read, this is the first one, which is I forget what editions these are, what they call these ones, but I've only read this concludes 2 volumes. So technically I've only read the first 2 volumes of the series. I need to find, these are the perfect editions, that's what they're called. I need to read the rest of the perfect editions, but whew, y'all, this is wild. This is a wild series, but also a very good series. The next one that I have on this list is How Dare the Sunrise. I just recently wrecked this one on Instagram, and Mara from Books Like Well read it and absolutely enjoyed it. Was not expecting it to be as emotional as it was. It is definitely an emotional nonfiction book. It is about a young woman, once again, let's put it this way, it's about a young woman and her family who end up as refugees. So the story, once again, is one of those American dream type things where perception of America and reality are 2 different things. It's a nonfiction book. It's based, of course, on this young woman's life. And I think that it also is an interesting look at what happens when you have certain people step in to be like aid to a lot of refugee communities, and how they don't adequately prepare them for what they're walking into. I don't think that they expected to be in the situation that we're in. They ended up, I can't remember where they ended up, but it was a really cold place, and they weren't prepared for that. Like, that was not weather that they had ever experienced, and just not preparing them or setting them up for like those small things, those expectations of the small things. It's like, we're helping these individuals that are refugees, but are we really preparing them for the culture shock, the difference of being here in America, and especially those that are Black? Like, coming to America and being Black is, especially if you've never been in an area where it's such blatant, discrimination going on, it's a shell shock. It is a shell shock to come here and experience that. And I've been in conversations where, like, there's a woman that I had a conversation with, and she immigrated to the United States, and that was when she became like really aware of her Blackness because of the discrimination that happens here. So Very emotional book, but really, really great nonfiction book. I had to include the Cartel series on here. I have not read this third book, but I've read the first two. This is by Ashley Antoinette and Jaquavis. And the reason why I included this on this list is because the Cartel wasn't technically my first foray into street lit, but it is the most modern, I don't want to say modern, it is the most recent foray that I had into street lit. And I think that a lot of times street lit gets a bad reputation, and I don't think that it's fair of the reputation that it gets a lot of times. And I'm not just talking about here in booktube, I'm talking about just in like the literary world in general. It does not get its fair seat at the table. And this really made me look at street lit very differently. I gravitate towards Ashley Antoinette. I am currently reading her ethics series, and it's interesting. It's just great writing and storytelling that I think people don't expect it, which is super unfortunate. And I feel like at one point I was one of those people until I said, you know what, like, pull back and like stop making assumptions and generalizations about a genre that you haven't even stepped your foot into. So picking up the Cartel series really opened up new doors for me in terms of reading street lit and learning like how much I really enjoyed it. And it says a lot to not make assumptions about a genre and not to believe everything that you hear about genres that people are not, necessarily giving it the credit that it's due. So yeah, I had to include the Cartel series. The next two that I have on this list are both picture books. The first one is Do Is Talk, which people are like, what is that? So Do Is Talk is a very interesting picture book. The reason why I included this one is that it shows the beauty of artwork. The second one does as well, but it shows the beauty of artwork and the role that artwork plays in picture books. Do Is Talk, I don't even want to tell you what it's about because I really just want people to read it. It's not written in English or any recognizable language. Okay, it literally is about these bugs who are doing something. I don't want to tell you what they're doing because that's the whole point of the book. It's not a language that's decipherable. Like, you're literally figuring out the communication between these bugs through the artwork. And the fact that you don't know this language, you have no understanding, no context of what it is, except through these pictures, means a lot. It just really shows the vital importance of artwork in picture books. And it is one of those two that has stuck with me. I believe it is a Caldecott honor or winner, one of the two. But it has stuck with me. That's all that matters. It has stuck with me for the ages, and I think you should pick it up. The next one that I have is Soul Way by Lupita Nyong'o and illustrated by Vashti Harrison. This is a look at the joy that should be experienced by all Black children, but it specifically looks at Black children that are of a darker complexion. And it is important representation in children's books. And it is about a little girl who is navigating what it's like to have darker skin and how she is, compared to the rest of her family. Not anybody comparing her to the rest of her family. So kind of how she compares herself to the rest of the family, but how she appreciates the darkness of her skin. And honestly, Vashti Harrison's illustrations do a number. Vashti Harrison is one of the best illustrators in the game. Just beautiful artwork, y'all. Just absolutely beautiful artwork. It's one of my favorite picture books, and I don't do a lot of celebrity picture books for a lot of different reasons. You'll find that a lot of librarians actually don't do a lot of celebrity picture books, but this is one that it is a celebrity picture book, but it's one of the best ones that I've ever read. And the last one, of course, I have on this list is Long Way Down by Jason Reynolds. Y'all should have known a Jason Reynolds book was going to end up on here. Jason Reynolds had to make an appearance. There was no way I could have made this list without him making an appearance. I chose Long Way Down because Long Way Down is another one that has stuck with me. I've read this book 3 times, and I talk about this all the time because I still haven't figured it out. I've read this book 3 times. It's about a young boy who loses his brother to gun violence. And he is thinking about whether he's going to continue this cycle of gun violence by possibly killing the person who he thinks killed his brother. And Jason Reynolds had spent some time with some kids that had been incarcerated and really was getting to know them. And this is a story about young kids who end up in the cycle of gang violence, gun violence, and how I think they're perceived. But the reality is, how did they get here? Why are they here? Where did we fail them? Why are they in these situations? And this book is written in verse. It's not long, but there is something about the ending of this book that I don't want to talk about because I can't talk about it without spoiling the book. But there's something about the ending of this book. I think there's something about time. And Jason Reynolds, of course, has put this on his Instagram. He's talked about it on his Instagram. And when he talked about it in person, when I had met him, he was telling people, and I won't even say what he said because it's just, he was telling people about something about the ending of this book, and I just need to figure it out. I'm going to figure it out. But honestly, seriously, like, you have to read this book. You have to read this book. I mean, it's Jason Reynolds, my future husband. He just doesn't know it yet. All right, y'all. So those are 30 books to read before you turn 30. And like I said, this is definitely like a list that is very much so about stuff that I have read. I can't give you a list of books to read before you turn 30 that I haven't read. So I'm only pulling from the books that I've read in my lifetime that I remember that I've read, because there's a lot of books from my childhood that I don't remember reading. But I know that I was reading a lot. My mom used to keep me in the library. I just don't remember exactly everything that I've read. So it was nice kind of thinking about some stuff from my childhood and, when I was possibly like in high school and college and adulthood, and just thinking about the span of that time and picking 30 books. It was very, very hard to pick 30 books. And I'm sure if I was to do this list again in like 5 years, this list would be completely different because time changes everything and anything. But anyway, yeah, if you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up, click the subscribe button, hit the bell for notifications so you never miss a video. If you want to follow me on social media, you want to support the channel, all those links will be down in the description box below. Remember, if you have titles that you're interested in sharing, like, share them below in the comment box. Like, let's get everybody's TBRs to be blown out of the water. All right, y'all, I'll be back with another video soon.